Thank you. Mr. Bush, I want to return to what I said in my opening statement and commend you for your work to try to accelerate timelines for production of munitions. I know you and a lot of others have really been rolling up your sleeves and working long hours, but I think you'd agree that we're still not producing enough of what we need fast enough. That's both in our Army ammunition plants and the industrial base. I've dug into the tables behind the budget request. It's a shocking timeline, really, in some of these cases. Basic munitions, not ones that are complicated or advanced, like artillery shells, can take up to 2 to 3 years to produce. Can you just give us a general sense of why that is? I mean, we built the Pentagon in less time than it takes to make basic artillery shells today. So what's up with that?
So, Senator, the actual time, I believe the timelines reflected in the formal budget documents are, I guess I would say those are the traditional timelines that assume a lengthy contracting process, followed by, a staggered, sometimes slow on purpose to maintain level workload at the factory approach. So for conventional munitions, I can tell you that artillery shells, for example, it takes about a month to get the steel. Now there's always a flow of steel, but about a month to get the steel. That steel is only at Scranton Army Ammunition Plant for about 3 days. Then it goes to Iowa Army Ammunition Plant for load assemble pack, which also only takes about a week. So when we're going as fast as we can, like we are right now, those timelines can be faster. However, sir, right now, as you mentioned, the issue is capacity, not timeline. On precision munitions, your point is very well taken and still very much the case. So advanced munitions, Patriots, sometimes even Gimlers, things with seekers or advanced electronics, we are still, sir, in those, at times, 1 to 2 year timelines, but trying to go faster right now.
So thank you for that, and I probably want to continue that distinction. And another distinction I want to drill down on is what you said about contracting processes or timelines. I view those as bureaucratic constraints. Those are Gordian knots. I think, in my opinion, Gordian knots exist to be cut. In many cases, a sword, or at least as Congress, can be the sword. Then there's actual real-world constraints on the availability of certain inputs, whether it's steel, energetics, chips, what have you. Let's focus on that area first. What are the single worst bottlenecks we face in the real world constraints about these munitions? Because again, we're not talking about an aircraft carrier or stealth fighter. We're talking about in what are most cases are man-portable munitions. But what are the concrete real world bottlenecks that the Army is facing right now?
Yes, sir. So I think if we're talking about precision munitions, often it is the sensitive electronic components, so computer chips and everything behind them that leads to some of those timelines. So if you trace back to the original sources, that's where some of that comes from. Also, of course, our systems do have sophisticated systems to make them safer than what the Russians might produce or exportable. That also adds time. But most often it is the electronic components that take the most time, probably followed by solid rocket motors for a lot of our munitions that are rockets or missiles. The other elements are explosives and such really are the shorter poles in the tent.
Okay. And what are the best ways this committee and this Congress can provide the Army with ways to reduce those timelines, to open up those bottlenecks?
Yes, sir. So first of all, the most economically efficient way to make a production line better is to buy more. So that way you let the market do its thing, and it downstream suppliers get better. It helps the whole system. So that's number one. And thank you for your support on all of that. Number two, and thank you for the support last year, is multi-year techniques like multi-year procurement and advanced procurement. I think when we testified last year, we were exploring the ideas of doing those things for munitions. They hadn't been done before. We're doing them now. And making that normal, not an exception, will be vital, sir. So we have to get that right. One other leg in the stool would be, over time, working on continued, for example, Defense Production Act investments. So that is the tool the department has to go way down in the supply chain and directly invest in companies, often small ones at the third and fourth tier. Congress provided very generous additional DPA Title III funding last year. I think we're putting it to great work. I think we did it in the Cold War at a much larger scale, and I think that's a model for how, with the right authorities and the right money in the right place, we can be better prepared next time, sir. So
to be clear on that, you're not talking about up here at the primes or assembling things, but at the subcontractor or maybe even the subcontractor doing fairly kind of basic inputs, let's call them valves or gaskets or what have you, reaching down to that level with DPA authorities.
Yes, sir, and that's a big difference with DPA. So really, our normal input is at the top with the prime, and you hope that funding flows down and goodness of a production line gets down to those suppliers. DPA lets us go directly at some of those subs, which are often actually the most weak points. It's not the bigs. It's the sub-tier contractors.
Yeah, and oftentimes those subcontractors, one or two levels down, are providing those inputs for multiple primes or multiple different weapon systems, so there's a bottleneck there as well, right?
Yes, sir. In many cases, and we've got this now, I think we've got much better handle on mapping our own supply chains from the government side. We see those overlaps that industry might not see because they're looking at their supply chain, not the national supply chains.
One final question about inputs, drawing from a partner. Are you aware of NAMO's challenges in expanding in central Norway?
Not specifically, sir.
Their CEO said a couple of weeks ago that they would like to expand. Obviously, they're producing a lot of munitions that are in very high demand in Ukraine, but there is no electricity available in central Norway because all of the excess capacity is going to power servers for TikTok videos. He said they literally can't make more munition shells because of cat videos. Are you aware of any constraints on either our Army ammunition plants or in the defense industrial base because of electricity or other power inputs?
I'm not, sir. I believe we have other challenges. Some of I've mentioned and others, but I've definitely not heard that one. Not in the United States.
The NAMO CEO said he wouldn't have even put it past TikTok and the Chinese to specifically have cited their cat videos next to NAMO's production facility in central Norway. All right, I have more specific questions I'll save for a second round. Mr. Bush, I want to return to one more question about our opening conversation of the munitions issue at a high level. You stressed demand and how high demand could help keep the lines going, keep people employed in their high-skilled, specialized functions. I assume that means demand not just from our military, but also ally and partner military as well, right?
Yes, sir. Ideally, we don't have to provide all that demand. So it's very encouraging in that light that many countries in Europe in particular are now committing to spending more and buying some of our equipment. That is enormously helpful to keeping healthy production lines.
So it's good. It's not just good from a military standpoint that we have friends in Europe and the Middle East and the Western Pacific who wanted to buy more of our munitions, but it's also good for our workers and our companies here in the United States.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you. Now I want to get a little more specific. The budget request includes investments to support prototyping for the long-range hypersonic missile, flight tests for the mid-range capability missile, and initial fielding of the precision strike missile, or PrSM. As PrSM is one of the key long-range fire capabilities necessary and will be vital in a Pacific conflict. I just want to dig a little bit deeper on this. The Army is requesting $273 million to work on future increments of PrSM, $384 million for 110 increment 1 missiles. But I suspect that's likely inadequate for the need. What are the plans to expand production capacity of the PrSM increment 1 beyond 110 missiles per year?
So, Senator, I think that initial numbers reflects mostly the fact that it's a new missile. We are just ramping into production and transitioning away from ATACMS production to PrSM. I think to the degree we can, I know there was great support inside the department for this capability. So I think there's an opportunity there for expanded production, assuming current initial testing goes well. On the R&D for increment 2 and increment 4, these are improved future versions. Production for those is still a few years out, but if we set conditions right with a healthy production line for increment 1, that'll put us in a better place.
Can you say a little more about your plan for both increment 2 and especially increment 4?
Yes, sir. So increment 2, we hope to be able to give us a anti-ship capability that would provide anti-ship capability out of a HIMARS launcher at significant range. Increment 4, we hope, could more than double the range of increment 1. That will require a new propulsion system, but the science and technology is underway on that. Again, all launched out of a HIMARS, which has proven highly successful in Ukraine, very difficult to locate, easy to move around. This would be a dramatic increase in the Army's ability to create problems for a potential, fight with China, for example, because we could station those everywhere.
Okay. What's the prospect for multi-year procurement for PRISM, as you've done for PAC-3 and Gimlers?
So, Senator, as soon as we have that production line up and running and the cost is well understood on increment 1, I think it could be a very good candidate for a multi-year approach.
Okay. I also understand from your testimony and statement that the operational evaluation of the extended range cannon has revealed some engineering problems. Would you please say a little bit more about those challenges and about the Army's progress on the cannon?
Yes, sir. So the extended range cannon program, I think we have been on a very aggressive timeline. We have built 7 or 8 prototypes, and we took them immediately into full testing. That testing has revealed challenges. I would say there are more engineering and mechanical challenges, but still there they are. While disappointing, I think it is good that we found them now before we went into a full production for this system, for example. We are still doing testing. I believe we will know more over the summer about the degree of the challenge and the extent to which we need to adjust our budget request this year and in future years, and look at the portfolio overall and see where that capability fits in terms of just overall improvement in Army range for cannon systems. I would mention there's great R&D work going on, for example, on new munitions that can also provide very long range out of existing cannons. So a mix of those two approaches might be warranted.
Mr. Bush, again, want to go back to the defense industrial base question. For the past few years, Congress has shown a willingness to fund and accelerate needed projects for the Army's organic industrial base. To that end, what projects within the Army ammunition plant modernization plan could be accelerated if Congress provides you with the necessary funding? And could you also explain how these projects would prepare the Army for conflict with China?
Yes, sir. So I think the great work done by my predecessor and General Daly at AMC was to develop a 15-year plan. And at the time, some questioned us, like, why have a 15-year plan? Well, sure enough, all of a sudden there were more resources. And we had a plan with shovel-ready projects ready to go. We still have that. So, sir, you mentioned one. I think it's in the UPL list that certainly would be a strong candidate for Radford. There are others, and we can provide a detailed list, 1 to N, up to perhaps 10 or 15 projects as a follow-up if I could. There is a limit of absorption at some places because we, of course, have to keep these plants running while we're modernizing them. So you can't just shut the whole place down and modernize it. We're bumping up against that in a couple places, but I think we found that there's always more work that can be done. And there's 2 types of projects. Some are really directly tied to increasing production capacity or automating systems or modernizing with regard to safety. Those are the ones that usually get the most attention. Others, though, that are equally as important is those long-term investments in the infrastructure of these places. So security, cyber investments, more resilient electricity generation on site, better roads. Those things matter too, sir. So I think we are open to a dialogue and a detailed level of what projects could be accelerated where, based on what members might have in mind.
Okay. We've been talking a lot about how to make these things. Let's talk about now where to put them and how we'd use them. General Rainey, could you talk a little bit about how pre-positioned stocks could support the Army's role in the Western Pacific to include the possibility of pre-positioned stocks afloat?
Senator, thank you very much. So it gets to both the priority of the Indo-Pacific, the long lines of communication and contested logistics. So absolutely, the pre-position has kind of like a deferred term. So whether you're talking about APS traditionally, but absolutely the ability to position supplies forward in theater and Indo-PACOM, I fully agree that that is something we need to be doing. I know General Flynn is pursuing that aggressively as the Army commander out in the Pacific. If you look at one of the observations and lessons from Ukraine, I think, is if you look at how fast we were able as a country to react and support Ukraine, it was underpinned by a lot of things, one of which was the amount of capability that we already had, forward position, the partnerships we had, the training capabilities that we had in Europe at 7th ATC, and the relationships we had with partners. So replicating that in the priority theater, I fully support and agree with, sir.
And what about the prospects specifically of floating pre-positioned stock?
There's a business case, and ships at sea with a lot of stuff on them have some risks associated with it, but I would defer to Mr. Bush on that.
So, sir, we have our APS 3 set, which is our current one afloat set. We did have to add funding for it in '24 just to maintain it due to some increased costs, for example, on ship leases. But that's a vital capability, and the Army is committed to maintaining it. Expansion of APS 4 beyond where it is today heavily relies on really work of the State Department and others on getting access to these countries so we can build the locations. There's anywhere in the Philippines, Australia, other Southeast Asian locations would be things that the Army, I know, has looked at and planned against. I believe the department's working through getting to good so we can start that process. I can tell you in our current, of course, we're working on fiscal year '25 already, how to expand APS 4 is a critical issue the Army's still working through.
If they're not floating, they have to be on land somewhere, as you just alluded to. Just tell us in plain language, like what's the plan or the concept for preventing China from blowing all that stuff up in the early stages of a conflict?
Yes, Senator. So the ability to position anything gets to the one thing that's an even bigger problem than contested logistics, and that's the ability to protect anything you forward position. And there's a kinetic aspect, so air and missile defense and integrated, that's never going to be the total solution. So utilizing concealment, deception. One of the advantages of land-based capabilities, whether it be sustainment or long-range fires, is they're more agile and able to move them. So good tactics and fighting. We're not going to be able to put anything in range and assume it's going to stay safe unless we fight to keep it safe. So it's a balancing act. How much you go forward, you better be able to protect it, and we're pursuing those efforts.
You just touched indirectly, so I'll ask you directly about something I sometimes hear from other senators who are on the committee or just normal Arkansans who wonder about it. It's like, if we're going to be fighting China one day, isn't it going to be all out in the sea and in the air? The Army is fighting on the ground, so what's the Army going to be up to out in the Western Pacific? Why does the Army need to worry about that? So could you just, here in public, explain in plain language what the Army has to do with a fight that, if you just look at the map, appears to be all on water and in the air?
Well, thank you, Senator, and I'll try and do that. We fight as a joint force, so there's not such a thing as an air maritime theater, or any more than there's such a thing as a land theater. So the strength of the joint force is everybody brings their capabilities to bear. More specifically, the Army, as our Secretary said, has several responsibilities to enable the joint force. So command and control are Title X responsibilities for both protection and sustained logistics. But we're absolutely going to be able to, and need to, control land, whether it's to position Air Force assets to support the Navy's operations where they have to come and touch land, to secure ammunition sustainment. So there's absolutely a role. We're going to always need the ability, number one, to deter them first, because this is a war we don't want to have, and that's underpinned by them believing that they would lose in a ground war with us. And if we do transition to conflict, we're going to have to be able to take land away from the enemy, and if they defend it, that means taking it the old-fashioned way by killing them, and secure it and protect the joint force. So there's absolutely a role for our Army and every other service in what would be a horrific war.
Thank you. Mr. Bush, I want to talk about the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IBAS. It began a new stage of development recently. In December 2022, after several critical soldier touch points, the Army approved the purchase of 5,000 IBAS 1.1 systems. At the same time, Microsoft agreed to develop the new IBAS 1.2 system, which will, if successful, change the design of the system and improve its performance. FY22 appropriations included a $394 million reduction in IBAS procurement, citing the original spending request as ahead of need. In March 2021, the Army awarded Microsoft a deal worth up to $22 billion over the next 10 years to move the IBAS program from rapid prototyping to production. Mr. Bush, why has the Army included some IBAS funding in the base budget while shifting some funds to two different projects on the Army's unfunded priority list?
So, Senator, I think what you're seeing there is the Army trying to rephase that program. We unfortunately, we did a very difficult test with it and found all the problems. While that's good that we found the problems, still disappointing and not the outcome we were looking for. One thing I would say is our ability to restructure that program on the fly here very quickly to try to get to 1.2 is because of the new authorities we're using. That would have been almost impossible under a traditional system. To your specific question, we laid in funding we thought was sufficient to just get over the line to get 1.2 developed in #24. The U4 items would let us go a little faster into actual production if it proves successful this year, sir. So I think we are taking a deliberate approach, whereas the first time around was honestly very, very aggressive on timeline and production ramp up. This time we are being more cautious. We want to make sure, Microsoft, they have to deliver. This 1.2 system needs to be exactly what the Army needs, or we're not going to produce it. So I think, sir, that's one reason we scaled the funding back that way.
Okay. General Rainey, Mr. Bush hinted at my next question. How confident are you that the testing for 1.2 will be successful?
I'm very confident. It's not just the technical testing aspect, but one of the successes of our modernization effort is using soldier touch points. So because we have 5,000 of them, we are going to continue not putting them into operational units where there would be a potential impact, but we're going to not just let them sit in a connex somewhere. We're moving them around to places like the Maneuver Center of Excellence, for example, where we'll have some of our experienced soldiers continue to do that. We're working with Microsoft, so we have the users working hand in hand as we develop the next thing, and we're going to get it and we're going to test it with real war fighters and get that soldier feedback. So I'm confident both that we'll test it effectively, because we always do, the rigor that we put into the last one, but I'm really kind of, what I'm going to wait and hear from is the staff sergeants and the lieutenants and company commanders providing user feedback.
Okay. And if that testing does not go as well as we had hoped, the Army is prepared to take a look at the program?
Yes, sir. So institutionally for the Army, it's always a very hard decision to admit we can't succeed somewhere, but this is a potential area where, look, if the testing doesn't prove out very quickly that it's capable and going to get us what we need, the Army is absolutely prepared to end that arrangement and seek a new competition.
Okay. I want to turn in the time remaining to Abrams tanks. Mr. Bush, the Army's FY24 unfunded priority list includes $533 million for Abrams SEP version 3 procurement to achieve a complete armored brigade combat team set. Those additional tanks would decrease the estimated cost per unit from $17 million, that's 34 tanks at current funding, to $12.3 million, 87 tanks. And resourcing this requirement would accelerate the fielding of the M1A2 SEP version 3 tanks to one active component BCT by year. So the Army included 533 on its unfunded priority list for the Abrams tank procurement, but that seems to have become something of an annual occurrence, appearing on the unfunded priority list as opposed to the base request. Can you tell me why this seems to continue year after year of this funding for tanks going on the unfunded list as opposed to the base request?
So, Senator, of course, the Chief of Staff of the Army, it's his list in terms of why it appears there, but your question is a very fair one. I believe, as I mentioned, we have accepted some risk there in the base budget request. We don't think it's too low, but that is less funding than, as articulated in the UPOL, would be perhaps ideal. There is another mitigating factor, however, and that's recent increases in foreign military sales. So A very large order from Poland is going to end up being more than 300 tanks worth of work. A recent order from Romania will give us in excess of 50 or 60 or so additional tanks of work. And then there's, of course, potential for additional tanks for Ukraine long-term. So we are always trying to balance between foreign military sales and our production to keep a healthy production line. But I think the chief, as articulated in the UPOL, believes that was an important one. It's a very large amount of money, so I think I would defer to him on his specific thoughts for why that was so high on his list.
Thank you.